Welcome to the Act and Unwind podcast, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you can locate fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so that more people can find our show. This week, I'm joined by Stephen Barrows, Acton's Managing Director of Programs, and Dan Huger, Research Fellow and Librarian here at Acton. Today, we'll talk about a different way to think about social disorder in America. But first, I want to go to South Africa. Of course, I can't go to South Africa because we now have travel restrictions in that country because of the identification of the new Omicron variant of COVID-19. This has been a somewhat unwelcome refresher on the pronunciation and order of Greek letters. But we have this new Omicron variant now, and we've already seen some pretty dramatic reaction to it in that you have travel prohibitions between the United States and South Africa. You have travel restrictions being put up in Israel as well. And it strikes me that we are really collectively getting out ahead of ourselves on this one because we don't really know a whole lot about this variant yet. And what we do know comes from doctors in South Africa who've been saying symptoms have generally been mild. You know, it's not the kind of thing at this point in time with the information we have at this moment to be overly concerned about. And when you couple that with what we know about the progression of diseases in general, that as they mutate, they get more transmissible but less deadly, that we really are getting out ahead of ourselves on this one. And I wonder, how long do you think this kind of reaction to different variants, because there will be more variants, we've got a whole Greek alphabet to work our way through, are we going to continue having this panicked reaction to a variant every time a new one is discovered?
One of the things I think disturbs me is that we're taking such a risk-averse approach, right? We've already learned through this pandemic process that our response has to be weighing both the risks associated with the disease as well as the economic impact of those who try to respond to contain it. Now, as I understand, it's already emerged in Canada at this point from people who had traveled from Nigeria. And so here you have South Africa as sort of the genesis of this latest variant. So, going forward, I think that this is where the economists need to speak up more loudly and clearly, saying, no, wait a second, just don't instinctively shut down economic activity. We already know that has a significant cost to individuals and livelihoods and so forth. And so, granted, I don't know, have no epidemiological background, but in this case, I think you're right. People are already saying that the symptoms of this Omicron variant seem to be fairly mild. And so why don't we take a wait and see rather than an instinctive knee-jerk reaction to shut things down and allow people to gather data. And if it proves that this thing is more severe and more lethal than previous variants, then, of course, respond accordingly. But the public health measures need to be commensurate with the risks involved and not instinctively in the other direction.
There's also the plain fact that while travel restrictions have helped in a few limited cases, let's say Australia and New Zealand, those travel restrictions are of an entirely different order of magnitude than what we've seen.
Well, in an entirely different location where it helps that they are an island.
Yes. No, that helps. And yeah. And I don't think, in a nation, and those are also very much smaller populations than the United States. So it's easier to do this sort of tracking and tracing and those sorts of things. So I think, there's a tendency, as you're raising the alarm as public health officials of, okay, there's this new variant, there's a bias towards doing something with that. And that's a trap that public policymakers often fall into.
Well, you have, I think, when Steve pointed to this, what is clear to me and has been clear for a while is what we have is a failure of political leadership. Because I've made this point before, probably even on this podcast, that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, in the name there, you know what their writ is. You know why they exist, to control and prevent diseases. And if that is the only thing that you're charged with, then you would be willing to overlook a lot of the trade-offs because you have only one goal, and that is controlling and preventing disease. Trade-offs really do not factor into your calculus on how to handle that. You would do pretty much anything and everything to accomplish the goal that is clearly stated in the name of the organization. But that's why the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are not the people ultimately making decisions. We elect political leaders to do that because political leaders are supposed to balance different concerns and different organizations, because you're going to have your Council of Economic Advisors, I would hope, pushing back and saying, yes, we can't do again what we did. And I would also assume that Joe Biden has political advisors who are telling him that there is just no appetite whatsoever out there. As afraid as the people out there who are most afraid of this Omicron variant are, there is not enough of them, and I'm not even persuaded that those people themselves have any desire to go back to, March, April of 2020 level lockdowns. So I think we clearly see here a failure of political leadership to tell the public health bureaucracy to pump the brakes on all of this, and to just not even to acknowledge, of course, internally they can acknowledge we've discovered a new variant of all of this, but the kind of running around with everyone's hair on fire screaming, oh my goodness, we've discovered the Omicron variant. We just don't know enough that it warrants that kind of reaction.
Right. Another thing, I would at least like to see some consistency. And so, for example, I was reflecting earlier when I first heard about the Omicron variant. I thought, well, okay, how have we approached variants over the years to influenza? Now, of course, we've had many more years to study and see what happens with influenza. We know that there have been, obviously, the Spanish flu was catastrophic for populations. But do we instinctively react with a new variant of the flu in a way that we are also now responding to new variants of this COVID-19. And it seems like we're treating this significantly different than the way that we approach the flu. Yes, we know that there could be an extremely bad flu. And of course, we know COVID-19 was not merely a flu. It had very, very severe mortality rates and so forth. But I would like to at least see some consistency. And right now, I don't know and see no evidence of that kind of consistency in how we're approaching these different types of infectious diseases.
There's also a way in which I think the general public is in a very different place. A lot of this sort of hysteria seems more media-driven, and also, maybe a little bit of it cultivated by policymakers who want to make some changes, because I think a lot of people are frustrated. They've got sort of that fundamental insight of Groundhog Day of, what if every day was the same and nothing you did mattered? We've had some public policy, public health successes, but those have been basically, targeting, this severe, we've had vaccine development, we've had a vaccine rollout, we've had these sorts of like basic sort of, meat and potatoes public health policy that we've done, but that hasn't been able to prevent any of this. And I think people at this point realize that it's an extremely rare thing to eradicate a virus, particularly a respiratory virus, and that there needs to be some sort of shift into not dealing with this as an emergency with every new variant, but a sort of sustainable public health policy to minimize death and disruption caused by this now endemic disease.
Yeah, the now endemic part is incredibly important. That goes to what Stephen was just talking about, that every year when they're formulating the flu vaccine, there's some guesswork involved to say that we think these variants are going to be the most prominent ones in this flu season, which is why you see some years the flu vaccine is up to 80% effective. Some years it's 60% effective. I think I remember one year that it was as low as 45% effective. I think the general idea is you'd still rather have it to have the 45% possible protection, but you're doing a little bit of guesswork each year. But you're right, we have come to accept that we're not going to know exactly how contagious and how bad the flu is going to be, but we're living with it in an endemic way.
Right.
And there just seems to be amongst some people a desire that we can't get out of pandemic mindset and into endemic mindset. And, there's a lot of reasons we could point to that. I think poor political leadership is part of it. I think not just poor political leadership, but the nature of our politics that is so tribal, that says, I believe, people don't say anymore, I believe X, Y, and Z, and therefore I identify with this political party. People say, I identify with this political party, and therefore I believe X, Y, and Z. And as a result, you get these polarized reactions to the way that we're addressing this pandemic, and even that are preventing us, from moving into the endemic phase, where we start to understand that we're just going to be living with this thing.
Yeah, and I think both that and what Dan had pointed out with the public reaction being a bit different from the media hype surrounding it. I think over time, people are just going to get into the habit of, another variant, just like, yep, another variant of the flu. I hope that's what happens. We certainly hope that, and I say that given that it's going to continue and it is going to be endemic, that's what I hope happens. That eventually people will just start making their own cost-benefit assessments and risk assessments for whether or not they want to get another booster, or whether or not this time around the new variant for the flu vaccine, they're going to get that one and one for the COVID. So I think over time that's probably what we'll end up seeing happen, because I can't imagine it's going to go on ad infinitum, where you're going to shut down from this country travel because a new variant has arisen anymore that you've been doing that with flu over the years.
With repeats of there's a new variant, there's a new variant, there's a new variant, I'm reminded of, in a former part of my life, I used to run political campaigns in Cook County, Illinois, where, as you might imagine, public corruption was a regular topic of discussion for those campaigns. And the biggest problem for, the goo-goos, the good government types that were running in opposition to the kind of endemic corruption that exists in Cook County politics is, by and large, citizens of Cook County, when they open the newspaper and they see a story about public corruption, go, what's for dinner? It just doesn't hit in the same way, because you've been deluged by it so often that it becomes part of the background noise. And I think perhaps this is one of the good examples of where our media cycle goes so fast and so furious that maybe that helps expedite the process to getting beyond where we are freaking out, even if we're being told, I had to look up my Greek letters here. So I guess the pi variant, which sounds delicious, probably isn't as fun, is what would be what is up next. We just go, okay, all right, what's for dinner, or I guess what's for dessert, and hopefully pie.
Yeah, there's been a unique. And this is one where the public has really, the public's been a leading indicator for policy all along. We saw, not universal, but we saw widespread public masking before mask mandates were instituted. We saw, folks talking about travel restrictions before any were implemented. And I think, there's certainly, Machiavellian actors in the political scene, and there's certainly corrupt actors in the political scene. There's also that ever important tie to the median voter. And there's a real sense in which I think people want the pandemic over, some of them in a more wishful thinking way than others. But I think that sort of attitude could be the catalyst to us turning to a more endemic sort of disease management policy in the future. There's an opportunity there for politicians on both the left and the right.
If I can reach back again into my more political past to make an observation, I think the overwhelming message that I took out of the election results that happened in Virginia and New Jersey. There was a lot of attempt to explain Virginia through the lens of education, and a lot of people particularly exercised about critical race theory to have that be the reason that parents reacted as they did. Well, in New Jersey, nobody was running a political campaign on critical race theory or really all that much directly on education in the way that education was such a focal point in Fairfax County, Loudoun County, the exurban counties of Washington, D.C. If you're going to account for the 10-point swing that you saw in Virginia and attribute it to education, then you have to somehow explain the 10-point swing you saw in New Jersey. I think to the extent it was education as an issue, it was parents' reaction to COVID policy as it related to schools. That in Fairfax, in Loudoun County, those were places where the schools were shut down all of last year.
Right.
All of the school year from late 2020 into early 2021. And people's reaction primarily, I think, was to that. And to piggyback on what you were saying, Dan, I think even if we haven't fully heard from voters yet, I think voters have by and large decided the pandemic is over. And this is a good opportunity to remind people that politicians and politics itself is often a lagging indicator of where public opinion is. The old, the old aphorism of the politician, identifies a parade and then runs to the front to try to tell everyone they started the parade. I think you will see a lot more people getting to the front of that parade when they realize that, a lot of people have decided we're really done with this. And there will be varying degrees to which people are willing to indulge in certain cases, limited masking or businesses that are going to, if not require, try to incentivize people into getting the vaccine. The level of indulgence of those kinds of things will vary, but by and large, I think people have decided that they are just done with this. And whether or not, and we'll come to this point in a moment here, whether or not public health officials and scientists have decided that the pandemic is over, the people who empower the political decision makers, I think have decided it's over.
I hope you're right.
So coming to the science point, I want to pull here from an appearance on CBS's Face the Nation yesterday from Dr. Anthony Fauci. Whose quote is, when asked about lawmakers, particularly Republican lawmakers who are criticizing him, his response was that they're criticizing science because I represent science. I just want to throw this out there. Steve, as an economist, I'm sure you're familiar with particularly Hayek's writings on the ideas of scientism, but we really have kind of transmoded science from what it actually is, a way of making inquiries and testing ideas, into a belief system, into a capital S science, that you see these signs outside of people's houses that, in this house, we believe in science. And undoubtedly, if you were to spend enough time asking those people certain questions, you would find something that they believe that is contrary to the scientific consensus on something.
Right.
But we really have moved into this period where now you have an individual claiming that they represent a line of inquiry into the empirical nature of the universe. But underlying it, that's not really what he's saying. He's representing a viewpoint, perhaps even an ideology. I wasn't here last week, but I discussed ideology in our time. That this is an ideology that is overwhelming us and a way of looking at what are unscientific questions through a lens that says we can scientifically decide them.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sure that Fauci's response was one of frustration of being in the hot seat and then trying to, summarize and him as being embodying the scientific conclusions that have been reached to date. But of course, to date, right? I mean, I think people have lots of questions. We know that science, and the phrase "the science is settled" is it just makes no sense. We know that science is a continual investigative process where we have hypotheses, we test those hypotheses, we come to tentative conclusions. Sometimes those we learn over time. We have a scientific revolution and more data is gathered and we end up having a complete change in perspective. So I think that, that's a reflection of, I'm sure, Fauci's frustration. But in the end, there are many other pertinent questions and ongoing questions that need to be answered. The science is not complete, and it's a continual dialogue between different studies that have to occur to be able to get the best information and to react accordingly. So, yeah, I unfortunately didn't read or hear exactly what the context was, but I'm sure that it was a sense of frustration. And to the extent that it was also a statement of hubris, well, I think that's once again an area where we could critique Fauci for his hubris.
So I think you're right to bring in ideology into this question, because I think there's the science as the nature of inquiry, as Stephen was talking about. There is a sort of scientism, a sort of ideological positivism, materialism. But what I think you're seeing here is science is a constituency. And this is a constituency of public health officials. This is a constituency of epidemiologists who are quite new at this modeling business and who in fact have appropriated most of it from economists for good or for ill. And then there's the sort of scientific media establishment. And we know there's coordination between all three in the sense of you get folks, from departments of epidemiology who then get government appointments. You also know that there are people in the government seeking to coordinate messaging with media, particularly with scientific publications. So there is this constituency, and this constituency is like any other constituency and can become politically captive, has its own interests, and is not identical with either the naive sort of ideological scientism, which, some of the more interesting critiques of pandemic policy have come from people who are seeking very high standards of evidence, who, have perhaps too high standards of rigorous evidence for what's needed for pragmatic political policy. And then also, are not interested in that open inquiry part, because the open inquiry part is really harmful for a unified political message. So I think science is one of those words that now means at least three things when people talk about it.
I think there's another constituency there as well, and that is those who have bought into the idea of the cult of expertise, that there are people with sufficient knowledge, and this is a good point I mentioned Hayek earlier, to plug the use of knowledge in society, because it is a very readable and short essay, and it is a revelatory essay on the simple thrust of it being that no one individual or group of individuals could possibly have and possess enough knowledge and be able to operate on enough knowledge to successfully plan an economy. Well, that really, I think, flows out into a lot of other areas of life as well. But I think you see that there's a constituency out there that is bought into the idea that technocratic experts can solve all of our problems. And you can trace threads of this back through American political history and world political history. You can go back to the progressive era, where you had a lot of conversation about approaching political problems as if we were engineers, that like back when the idea of engineering in a political or a social sense doesn't have the ickiness attached to it that it does now, that we can engineer our way out of societal problems, that we can use science as a way to approaching political problems, which really at the end of the day are value questions.
That's right.
And we can solve them scientifically, which is just something that really is not going to be possible. And you can even trace it back to Karl Marx in a way of a kind of scientific understanding of history that points to this capital H idea of history, that it is moving inexorably in one direction and towards one end. There's only impediments to our way of getting there. I think there is very much a constituency that exists out there who has bought into this idea that experts can save us from all of our problems. And it's just a lot messier than that. And I want to be clear. There are people who possess expertise in a lot of different fields, and they should be listened to. But this is the whole point of the design of our political system, which is to say that you want to hear from those experts, but you need somebody who can balance the concerns of multiple experts and the people without any specific expertise whose lives will be impacted by the decisions that are going to be made.
Yeah, I think your point goes right back to what Dan had initially said. On the one hand, you don't want to have the cult of expertise, and you also don't want to have what has been called the death of expertise, where everybody thinks that anybody has no background and experience can speak assertively on certain topics. So there's some spectrum in between the two, but unfortunately what's happened, especially when Dan points out that there's an urgency to act from a political perspective, you end up erring towards the cult of expertise, right? You have to claim the expertise to justify your action. And so we have to find some middle ground there where we both honor expertise and the people and the judgments that are being made by those who actually have specialties in those particular fields, and balance that against the respect for the individual freedom and choices to be able to understand that some of these experts have to go through a process too.
A good book that goes through, and this is broader than the pandemic, but that gets into sort of the history of some of these ideas of expertise in planning and some of the problems with it, and particularly extending some of the sort of Hayekian arguments, is the late economist Don Lavoie's book, National Economic Planning, What is Left, in which he sort of critiques, and he sees himself as sort of a man of the left, and in the sense as sort of a fundamentally sort of egalitarian person, but sees a problem with this sort of command and control approach to things. And he thinks that's naturally antithetical to sort of like a flourishing society and any sort of genuine scientific process and just general openness in society as a whole.
I want to turn our attention to just one more interesting note on the pandemic, on COVID, on the emergence of these variants, which is, as I mentioned, the variant that has just been identified that we're talking about is Omicron. And the next one should be Pi, followed by Rho, Sigma, Tau, Upsilon, Phi, Chi, Psi, and Omega. And for a lot of reasons, I hope we never get to the Omega variant, because the conspiracy theorizing that will go around the identification of an Omega variant would be, I think, catastrophic. It would register on the Richter scale. But it is worth noting that we skipped over, the World Health Organization skipped over 2 Greek letters in arriving at Omicron for the name of this variant. One of them is nu, and the explanation from the World Health Organization is new sounds like new variant. It's like, there's a new variant. It's like there's kind of a who's on first thing going on there. It's like, which variant? The new variant. I'm asking. But it also skipped over Z, which, as the World Health Organization said in explanation of their decision, that it's a common surname. Sure. But it also just so happens to be the name of Xi Jinping, who is the premier of China. And yeah, I think the reasons why they perhaps made this decision are abundantly clear. But when you couple it with, if I can draw in something a little disparate here, there was a story that I saw over the weekend, which is Disney Plus now has The Simpsons. They disappeared an episode of The Simpsons if you're streaming it in Hong Kong, which is the episode that takes place in Hong Kong, that includes a scene with a placard that says it's for Tiananmen Square, and it said, on this spot in 1988, nothing happened. And it is... You look at what's happening there, you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, which we've talked about before, and you look at what the World Health Organization is doing, and it's another reminder of how, boy, a lot of places are bending their will to what will or will not make the Chinese happy. That, especially if we're dealing with, this is somewhat trivial. What we call the variant is not entirely important, but you can look at other actions taken or not taken by the World Health Organization and clearly see that China's influence there is heavy. And that is probably not a good thing.
Well, I have to say, right out of the gate, I was frustrated that I saw that it was named Omicron, because I had hoped and thought that they would be using the NATO alphanumeric designations, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Foxtrot, Echo, et cetera. And they could have avoided the whole mess if they would have stuck to the NATO designations for these variants as opposed to the Greek alphabet. So, yeah, that is. I think this is more than likely reflective of that sensitivity. And in this case, and as you cited, the episode they visit Beijing, The Simpsons, and see the Tiananmen Square, you see it's completely erased from Hong Kong. And, there's no doubt we see this pressure, and this pressure then also being an economic pressure that if you don't do what we think you ought to be doing for, China's reputation, then we're just going to lock you out of our enormous market. And so, unfortunately, there is quite a bit of leverage here, and how that leverage then manifests itself in some of our non-governmental organizations, I can only imagine. But yeah, it is an issue that we're seeing, and this is almost an amusing, though perhaps trivial, manifestation of that.
So one of the interesting things is Pi is also a common surname among people, and Omicron is a common surname by Transformers. So
yes.
I mean this happens. One of the hopeful things along these lines is what Enes Kanter's been doing in the NBA, talking about both the situation of Uyghurs in China and the situation of forced labor in general. This is something, when Daryl Morey, the then GM of the Houston Rockets, came to the defense of the people of Hong Kong, he was sort of immediately silenced by the NBA in a way that Enes Kanter has not been, at least so far, although he says he has certainly gotten a lot of emails and text messages from folks who are angry. Perhaps we're starting to turn the corner on this sort of thing. And the sort of ridiculous things like the variant names is something that just brings more awareness. It sort of Streisand affects this whole phenomenon.
And by the way, didn't Cantor just announce that or confirm that he's changed his last name to Freedom?
Yes, he's changing his name to Freedom as he becomes an American citizen. Yes, so he'll have, in a league that once had World Peace on the back of a jersey, we will now have Freedom on the back of a jersey, which I guess it's probably the only way if you go back to pandemic era NBA where you could have social justice slogans on the back instead of names on the back of jerseys. He finally found a way to get Freedom as one of them on the back of a jersey. So good for him for that. I think your point is well taken, Dan, that sometimes it's the trivial things that drive the point home more than the more serious ones. And that is, you can take that as a sad commentary that we don't take the way that the World Health Organization acted throughout the pandemic, the way that they provided cover for China throughout the pandemic, that people don't take that seriously enough. But sometimes it is the trivialities. It's the things that just make you roll your eyes and go, oh, for crying out loud, you really didn't need to skip Nu or Z, but here we are. It's like Nu, even at one level, I can understand that. There was no reason. Like, again, if you're going by surnames, then there's problems with Pi. There wasn't a compelling reason other than the obvious one. And maybe that does help drive this point home for more people that China putting its thumb on a lot of organizations like this is a problem. And it is something that we'll need to reckon with in the future.
For sure.
I want to turn our attention now to what I thought was a really interesting piece that came out at the Dispatch from Yuval Levin, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, entitled The Changing Face of Social Breakdown. And we'll put a link to this piece in the show notes. And the thesis in this piece from Yuval is typically when we talk about social disorder, we talk about it and we think about it in terms of recklessness, of people living too fast, too crazily, doing reckless things, and there being consequences for that. And what Levin points to in this piece is you can look at the decline in a number of things that I think we would probably all be welcoming of and seeing that there's a decline in them. Things like teen pregnancy, teen deaths from auto accidents, the abortion rate has been declining. And his point is that we can look at those and recognize those to be goods, but we should also want to understand why they are happening. And a large reason why they are happening is fewer teens are dating. There's less communalism amongst teens. There's less teen sex. As a result, there are fewer teen pregnancies. People are getting married later in life. They are having children later in life because there's less coupling. There are fewer abortions because there are fewer potential cases where an abortion could be considered. Teens, the declining teen fatality rate in auto accidents is largely attributable to fewer teens are getting driver's licenses. And Levin identifies this as a different mode of social disorder in that people are not jumping into their lives. They are not getting engaged. And I liked his example. Liked is probably the wrong word, but I thought it was a revelatory example that previously, a popular drug would have been cocaine, which makes you go 1,000 miles an hour and really makes you jump into life. Obviously not recommending people use that as a means of jumping into life. But nonetheless, we can look at that as a drug phenomenon and problem compared to the crisis that we have been living through, which is the opioid epidemic, which slows people down. It makes people lethargic. It doesn't make them jump into their lives. And I found this piece fascinating because we do, I think, tend to think of social disorder primarily through the lens of recklessness, but that there is a new problem of people not engaging in life soon enough. And you'd almost at this point say you would take some of the problems that come from recklessness if more people were engaged with others and engaged with life itself.
Right. I think, just the idea that we're seeing society becoming more and more enervated, where there just seems to be we hear the term failure to launch, and there doesn't seem to be much ambition that there used to be. And there's, I'm sure, all sorts of complex sociological reasons behind this shift. But when I was reading his piece last week, I've simultaneously and by coincidence been reading a book, a 1999 book, in fact, by Lionel Tiger called The Decline of Males. And he makes a remark in there, and I'm not going to quote him or anything, but he makes this comparison, and that is, Karl Marx had this view that, the essence of human living is production, right? We become slaves to production. And he said effectively that in some sense, Marx trumped Darwin, where the essence of human living is production as opposed to reproduction. Now we're actually seeing, and I think in this piece, a problem where now Darwin himself and the urge to form families, the urge to reproduce, the urge to have children and grow and so forth, we're seeing all of that sort of go away. Where for whatever reasons, whether it be people are absorbed in social media, they just don't get opportunities to engage with one another. Levin points out the scourge of pornography and how that could be impacting family formation. But I think this report is worth significant study because we cannot continue on this trajectory with a below replacement level fertility rate, with high resignations out of the workforce, men who aren't out there working, et cetera. I mean, it's a real concern. And it is fascinating to see how it has shifted from the more cocaine-driven crises and teen pregnancy crises to one that's just complete enervation in society.
In a way, the social scientists have caught up to religion. They have discovered that, we are indeed living in revelations or in the Kali Yuga. These are things that there are robust theological categories to understand. Sloth, indolence, lukewarmness. Like, these are categories that we think about. A lot of it has to do with the shifting nature of work. Thomas Pynchon wrote a wonderful essay, I think this was in the New York Review of Books, on sloth as the essentially writerly vice, entitled Nearer My Couch to Thee. And that's sort of like intellectual labor itself. There's a greater temptation to indolence in it. So I think changes in the labor market might be part of this. You have, and this ties us back into the pandemic in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, in the ninth sutra of the second book, the Sadhanapada. It talks about the great obstacles, and one of those is self-preservation or the attachment to life, and it's the subtlest of all the afflictions, found even in wise men. And this is something that is very real, and this is where it's important to realize that vices sometimes work together, and and people will mix uppers and downers, as it were, as ways of sort of coping with social disorder, unhealthy ways, as opposed to, leading a virtuous life.
Hey, later this week, I'm going to be talking to Yuval about this piece for a future episode of Act in Line. And something else I heard him say on another podcast that we can pull this back to the pandemic for a moment. We've seen a lot of, again, we are kind of experiencing a lot of rapid change that was not predicted, particularly within regards to our work life. And I guess the upside of it would be that people can arrange their work affairs. Not everybody, but definitely a class of people can arrange their work affairs in a way that gives them more time at home and theoretically more time around family. I had a friend for years, a colleague, someone I used to work with, who, when he started change the nature of his consulting business, he arranged it in a way that, he lived in Charleston, South Carolina at the time, and is like, if I wanted to go to beach at 2 p.m. with my kids, I could take my kids to the beach at 2 p.m. I still would have gotten work done. I would have been productive. I think on one level we can celebrate that people are, because of advances in technology and some of the changes that have been either forced upon us by the pandemic or at least were already in progress and have been rapidly accelerated by the pandemic, can arrange their work affairs in a different way. But I think there's also the lack of Yuval's point was that there's communication and communion. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of communication now, the sharing of information and ideas amongst people, but we don't have as much and have a declining amount of communion. This is losing people from the workplace and a common office place. This is other, attending church services by live streaming them rather than attending them in person, participation in social organizations. That one of perhaps the dark cloud to the silver lining that I just gave about the changes in work habits is that we've made ourselves into more effective loners, that
right.
we can be more productive now being on our own, and that for our social nature, that is not a good thing.
Right, Eric. I think you're highlighting a couple of things that have been addressed in other forums here at ACT. And, one is technology itself is one of the major factors of economic growth and is a primary cause of our human flourishing over especially the past century. At the same time, technology itself is not neutral. And technology brings with it trade-offs, and it actually impacts human beings. And wanting to have a good and sound anthropology and understanding how technology impacts the human being, we have to take a look at it from a holistic perspective, not simply from the economic perspective. And so I think that we are seeing instances, especially if you go all the way back to this contraceptive pill, and I know that there's differences of opinion on this, but one coming from a Catholic background, the contraceptive pill also then has a significant moral implication here. But when you take a contraceptive pill as a revolutionary technology, you take a look at our modern day social media, you can see how these things have further separated the human communion, right, in many dimensions. And I think we're seeing it come to a head here. Dan had referenced religion. I think there's undoubtedly going to be an impact from a religious dimension here as well. And Mary Eberstadt has written some great work in this, How the West Really Lost God. And you can see how lack of family formation, low fertility rates tend to have a connection to lower religious observance. They're correlated together. And of course, there would be a debate on the cause and effect here. But so the article, and I'll be fascinated to hear a little bit more when you interview Yuval Levin on your next future podcast to go deeper into the depths of what this study actually showed us.
I think to your technology point too, to give another example for it, do we get the sexual revolution without the invention of the automobile? I wonder if we do, because it made the ability for people to escape from clear view to go off somewhere together.
Oh, yes, just mobility, right?
You can point to the disruptiveness of the automobile, of having far downstream effects that were never possibly considered. But I think the unreasonable reaction to that is to have the kind of mindset that seems to be taking some people right now, which is to say, we can find some way to rewind all of this, that we can go back 50, 100, 300, 800 years. We can live as serfs again and have a more integral social order, and that's going to be pleasing. And, and the reality is it's not. But I think this is where Acton's point of view is important, that we're not getting rid of the automobile. And I don't think we should get rid of the automobile. We are not getting rid of a lot of the communication technology we have now. And I don't think we should get rid of a lot of the communication technology we have now. We need to better understand who we are as human beings, who we are as people, to understand the impacts that it has on us, and to find ways, religion would be recommendable, obviously, to discipline ourselves in the use of these things so as to not be consumed by them. I think that's the optimistic view that we have to have for people, is that they can be disciplined. We can discipline ourselves to live in a world with these technological evolutions and make the best of them and not be claimed by the worst parts of them.
And this is the thing. I mean, if you look, you look at a society, let's say like India, which today is undergoing sort of a revival of the public status of religion. In fact, it's playing probably a greater role in Indian society than it has since independence. And you look, and their fertility rate just fell below replacement rate for the first time in recorded history. So this is obviously a more complex thing, and it has, and I think Eric gets to the point where there's an anthropological core to religion as a sort of technology for self-governance, that it's not the mere appearance of religion, the mere public talk of religion, but it has to do with, okay, are people actually internalizing those lessons? Are they? And that's a harder thing to measure, and that's a harder thing to get your head around. But it's a resource that's open to everybody in a host of traditions, and take and read.
It's interesting. So I have 5 children, and of course, want, like any parent does, them to succeed. And have had conversations with my older ones about their future vocational trajectory, college selection, and so forth. One thing I think that is interesting here is we do, as a society, have a focus on credentials, vocational success, economic success. All of that is well and good, but I think it's come to a certain extent at the expense of emphasizing success in terms of relationships, right? Where we really want to help people to understand that in the end, they say on your deathbed, you're not thinking about, oh, I could have spent more time in the office, right? You're thinking about your relationships. And so whether that manifests itself in marriage and family life for individuals, whether it's getting engaged with people just at your local community and organizations, your church, and so forth, I think we need to focus more on that. And I think this piece is illustrating that unfortunately there is sort of this swing to the side of the economic success, and even now we're seeing people failing to launch in that arena. They end up staying in there and dependent upon their parents or what have you. But over time, it's much broader. What constitutes the good life, right, is much broader than just economic success, and we need to think about it in terms of what the human person is and what they're designed to be.
I think a better understanding of work in that context, too, is valuable, right? Because I agree with you. You're not lying on your deathbed thinking that you would have rather spent more time at the office. And the implication or the continuation of that you hear from people is you rather have spent more time with your family. And that is probably largely true. But I think your point in general about relationships, that, of course, I want to spend time with my family. I want to spend time with my friends, too.
Right.
And people
Exactly.
who are colleagues in projects you have worked on, some of my closest friends now are people who I have worked with in the past.
For sure.
So it's, that the thing we did together was that work, but it built a relationship that is valuable, and that you want to spend time with those people because that relationship is valuable. And this gets to the point of, some of the concerns that I do think have merit about technology, communication technology that Yuval points out, replacing communion with other people.
Right.
That we are at the beginning of the launch of social media and Skype and Zoom and all of these, there's this idea that we were going to be able to bridge all these divides, right? That we were going to bring people together. And we've communicated a lot with each other, but we haven't established that that kind of communion with each other that is necessary to care about people beyond a two-dimensional version of them that looks at just the things they have to say and the things that they think and the things that they write, and to understand them as human beings. It's something markedly and substantively different in all of that we're getting less of.
Here's a question: the way that Yuval juxtaposes this as an opposition between a sort of insularity and life in community. What if what brings one to the other is neither? And what if what's missing, I mean, this is my diagnosis, which comes from more of a religious perspective than a social science perspective, is the spirit of service. Because what we're seeing in the individual sort of, we have now the metaverse, we have this idea of trying to cultivate false realities of communities because we think this abstract thing called community is what's missing. And that community can also oftentimes be immensely destructive. And it can also be, something that one seeks for one's own benefit, and can be just as selfishly ordered as slothfulness. And I think, what you need is that spirit of service to friends, to family, to community. If you go, and I think you see a lot of this in the, sort of the niche identity online religion these days, is a lot of this is what can the religion do for me? What can the religion signal for me? What can the religion transform me into, that rather than this is the way that I worship God and that I serve neighbors, and that this is what this is for. So I think community can be insidious too if it's not animated by that spirit of mutual concern and service for each other.
I think you can draw this back to Yuval Levin's previous work on institutions, right? Almost exactly what you said there is we have decaying institutions. Why do we have decaying institutions? And it is largely because they have ceased to perform the role that they're supposed to, which is to shape and mold people into better versions of themselves. I think this is also why within the Catholic Church, when I was living in Chicago, I would occasionally go to Mass at St. John Cantius, which is one of the few parishes in Chicago that has the Latin Mass. And what always somewhat amazed me, and what I did find heartening as well, is that the distribution of the age of people attending the Latin Mass there were disproportionately much older and disproportionately much younger, people in their early 20s. And I think there is a desire, they're seeking a church that asks something of them, people seeking institutions that ask something of them. The university is not asking enough of the students that participate in it. Newspapers are not asking enough of the journalists that work for it. As Yuval himself would point out, that Brown University and the New York Times are institutions, and they're supposed to be different institutions with different purposes, but they now exist primarily as platforms for people to stand on and yell about oppression. And you juxtapose that with, say, Steve, you were in the Air Force, the Marine Corps would be another example, that when somebody says, I'm a Marine, you know something about that person because of the process that they went through in that institution. You go in as one kind, you come out as another. If somebody said, I went to Harvard, I think you know a lot less about them than you do about somebody who says, I'm a Marine. And it's because that is a formative institution. And our institutions have lost that formative point that you're supposed to come together to do something. And service, in many cases, should be that one thing. This is why here at Acton we would view entrepreneurship as service. It is serving our brothers and sisters. Right. And because we've lost that sense of service, I agree, as I think relates back to that work that Yuval has done on institutions and their failure as well.
And to do something hard, right? That actually makes you feel good about yourself when you do something hard. If I tie my shoe in the morning, I don't feel good about myself. I don't say, yay, I just tied my shoe. But if my young child ties their shoe for the first time, on his own, hooray, he's going
Yes.
to feel great. He accomplished something hard. And so, I think it's really important that, as you point out, the service, that human contact, sacrifice for the other, all of those, I think, are important dimensions that are underlying the subtext of this study that was conducted by AEI and Institute for Family Studies.
My late Presbyterian grandmother used to say, if you want to feel good about yourself, wash the dishes.
That's a perfect place to call it a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link to where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this program. Thanks to Steve, thanks to Dan, for the Acton Institute. This is Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.